A Heart's Reckoning by Nolan Barrett. The autumn wind whipped through Elizabeth Blackwood's chestnut curls as she stood at the bow of the merchant vessel Morning Star, her gloved hands gripping the wooden railing. The English coastline had long since disappeared behind them, and now there was nothing but endless ocean ahead. She pulled her wool cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off both the chill and her growing sense of uncertainty. "Miss Blackwood, you really shouldn't be up here in such weather," called Mr. Harrison, the ship's first mate. His weathered face creased with concern as he approached. "The captain expects rough seas ahead." Elizabeth turned to face him, chin lifted stubbornly. "I've spent quite enough time below deck, Mr. Harrison. Besides, the fresh air helps settle my stomach." The truth was, she needed to escape the suffocating confines of her tiny cabin and the weight of her circumstances. At 22, she was leaving behind everything she'd ever known to take a position as governess to a wealthy family in Boston. With her father's recent passing and the discovery of his overwhelming debts, she had little choice but to seek employment across the Atlantic. "As you wish, miss. But don't stay too long." Harrison tipped his hat and continued his rounds, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts once more. Or so she believed, until a deep voice behind her said, "The sea has a way of drawing out our deepest contemplations, doesn't it?" Elizabeth startled, turning to find herself face to face with James Crawford, the ship's captain. She'd seen him from afar during the first few days of their journey, but never this close. His presence was commanding, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that the wind had blown into casual disarray. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking shade of green that reminded her of the sea itself. "Captain Crawford," she said, dropping into a small curtsy. "I apologize if I'm in the way." He smiled, the expression warming his otherwise stern features. "Not at all, Miss Blackwood. Though I echo Mr. Harrison's concerns about the weather. We're sailing into a strong headwind. I've noticed you know the names of all your passengers," Elizabeth observed, trying to ignore how her pulse quickened under his steady gaze. "It's my duty to know who's aboard my ship," he replied, moving to stand beside her at the railing, "including strong-willed young ladies who prefer the company of sea spray to the shelter of their cabins." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm not usually so rebellious. But after 3 weeks at sea, I find myself craving more than the four walls of my cabin." "Understandable." His voice held a note of sympathy. "It's not an easy journey, especially for someone traveling alone." "Did Mr. Harrison tell you about my circumstances?" she asked, uncertain whether to feel exposed or touched by his awareness. "He didn't need to. I've made this crossing enough times to recognize the look of someone leaving their old life behind." He turned to face her fully. "Though I admit, I'm curious what brings a clearly well-bred young lady to make such a journey unaccompanied." Elizabeth hesitated, then decided there was little harm in sharing the truth. "My father's death left me with few options. The position in Boston offers a fresh start." "Ah," Crawford said softly. "My condolences, Miss Blackwood." "Thank you." She managed a small smile. "Though I must say, Captain, you seem rather young to command your own ship." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I inherited the Morning Star from my uncle 5 years ago, at the age of 28. She's been my home ever since." Their conversation was interrupted by a loud crack of thunder. Crawford's expression immediately shifted to one of concern, as he scanned the darkening horizon. "That's our cue, Miss Blackwood. I must insist you return below deck now. This storm will be upon us soon." Elizabeth nodded, but as she turned to go, the ship pitched sharply. She lost her footing, and suddenly found herself caught in the captain's strong arms. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met, and Elizabeth became acutely aware of how close they were, of the warmth of his hands through her cloak. "Careful," he murmured, steadying her before stepping back. "Allow me to escort you to your cabin." The next few hours proved the wisdom of Crawford's insistence. The storm raged through the night, the ship creaking and groaning as massive waves crashed against her hull. Elizabeth lay in her narrow bunk, unable to sleep, thinking of the captain above deck, guiding them through the tempest. When morning finally came, the sea had calmed, though the sky remained overcast. Elizabeth made her way to the deck, needing to see the aftermath for herself. She found Captain Crawford at the helm, looking tired but satisfied as the crew worked to repair minor damage from the storm. "Good morning, Miss Blackwood," he called out, gesturing for her to join him. "I trust you weathered the night well?" "As well as could be expected," she replied, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "Though I doubt you got any rest at all." "A captain's duty never ends," he said with a slight shrug. but we've come through worse." Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth found herself seeking out the captain's company more and more. Their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy, and she discovered a keen intellect behind his practical seafaring knowledge. He told her stories of his travels, of distant ports and strange customs, while she shared tales of her childhood in the English countryside. What began as chance encounters evolved into a routine. Each evening, weather permitting, they would walk the deck together, watching the sun sink into the ocean. Elizabeth tried to tell herself it was merely friendship born of proximity and shared isolation, but she couldn't deny the way her heart raced whenever their hands brushed accidentally, or how she found herself dreaming of those sea-green eyes. One particularly clear evening, as they stood watching the stars emerge, Crawford broke their comfortable silence. "We'll reach Boston in less than a week." Elizabeth's heart constricted at the reminder. "Yes, I suppose we will. Have you given much thought to what awaits you there?" "The Worthington family seems kind in their letters," she said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. "Their children are young, and they've promised me my own quarters in their home." Crawford was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "And is that truly what you want, Elizabeth? To be a governess in a stranger's home?" It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her shiver. "What choice do I have?" He turned to face her, his expression intense. "There are always choices. I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you've come alive at sea. You have a spirit that yearns for freedom, for adventure. Would you really be content confined to a Boston drawing room?" "What are you suggesting, Captain?" Elizabeth whispered, hardly daring to hope. "I'm suggesting that there might be another path." He took her hands in his, and Elizabeth felt the rough calluses earned from years of sailing. "The Morning Star needs a mistress, and I need you, Elizabeth. Your intelligence, your courage, your laughter. Stay with me. Marry me. We'll see the world together." Elizabeth's mind whirled with possibilities. But what of propriety? Of society's expectations? "At sea, we make our own rules," he said with a gentle smile. "I won't pretend it would be an easy life, but it would be one filled with purpose and passion. And love, if you'll have me." Looking into his eyes, Elizabeth saw the future she'd never dared to imagine, one of freedom and adventure, with a man who saw her true spirit and cherished it. "Yes," she breathed, feeling as though her heart might burst. "Yes, I'll marry you." Crawford pulled her close, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home. The kiss was tender at first, then deepened with all the passion they'd held back over the weeks. When they finally parted, both breathless, Elizabeth laughed with pure joy. "What will your crew think?" she asked, still wrapped in his embrace. "They already think it," he chuckled. "Harrison's been giving me knowing looks for weeks. They'll be glad to see their captain finally settled." The next few days passed in a blur of happiness and preparations. Word spread quickly among the crew and passengers, and Elizabeth found herself touched by their genuine congratulations. Harrison, with a twinkle in his eye, offered to give her away at the ceremony. They were married 3 days before reaching Boston, with the ship's chaplain officiating. Elizabeth wore her best blue dress, with wildflowers the crew had preserved from their last port woven into her hair. As she spoke her vows under the vast ocean sky, she knew she'd found not just love, but her true destiny. When the Morning Star docked in Boston, Elizabeth sent a polite letter to the Worthingtons declining their position and explaining her marriage. Then, standing on the deck beside her husband, she watched the American shoreline fade away as they set sail for their next adventure. Years later, Elizabeth would still climb to the bow in rough weather, though now she wore a captain's wife's confidence along with her wool cloak. And James would still find her there, drawing her into his arms as they faced the horizon together, their love as vast and endless as the sea itself. The sound of their children's laughter would echo across the deck, 3 sturdy young ones who learned to walk on rolling waves and count by stars. They grew up on their father's stories and their mother's courage, proud heirs to a legacy of love that defied convention and found its home on the endless ocean. Elizabeth never regretted her choice. In trading drawing rooms for ship's cabins, she'd found not just love, but freedom. She'd found a life where she could be fully herself, where adventure waited around every horizon, and where each sunset brought the promise of another dawn together. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the stars wheeled overhead and the Morning Star cut smoothly through dark waters, Elizabeth would stand with James at the helm, their hands clasped together, and thank whatever twist of fate had brought her to that first stormy day on deck, when a captain with sea-green eyes had seen the truth in her heart and offered her the world.